question is that if one has to choose between two opinions, both of them supported by evidence, but one seems to open a door to fitna and the other one doesn't, right? Then one could say in that circumstance it's better to choose the one which less likely to open the door to fitna. However, one should not necessarily take that and then hammer the other person to say, well, no, your opinion is, you're going to cause fitna, etc., so don't follow that opinion. No. So people have the right, though you might personally choose to choose one opinion because you feel it has less opportunity for fitna, whereas other people feel that, the fitna is there anyhow. It existed in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, and he didn't insist and make it obligatory, so why should we have to go and do it now? So if somebody wants to conclude in that way, then that conclusion has to be respected also. Okay, inshallah, we'll close the session. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسول الكريم وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن استنى بسنته إلى يوم الدين. All praise due to Allah, and may Allah's peace and blessings be on the last Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and on all those who follow the path of righteousness until the last day. In the previous session, we began to look at the position held by the early generation of scholars with regards to taqleed. Taqleed being the blind following of the madhab. Although technically speaking the term taqleed just means following, when it's used in this context here we're referring to a blind following, where a person doesn't seek to understand the basis of the ruling, the evidences for it, etc. It's just enough you say do, don't do, and then you follow it. We said that kind of following belongs really only to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and that the early generation of scholars were opposed to that way of thinking. And we gave the examples from the leading imams of the Sunnah, the great imams Abu Hanifa, Imam Malik, Shafi'i, etc., in which they spoke against this development. They were aware that the tendency for this to happen was natural to some degree, and they fought hard against it by either preventing their students from writing down their opinions, or they, after the opinions were written, they were told to change them or to delete them. Some of them took that step. Others would just not have it written until everybody had agreed upon the point. At any rate, we gave sufficient examples of each of the scholars basically, emphasizing that they were human beings capable of making errors, and that the real criterion should be in the evidence, and that is the evidence found in the hadiths themselves. And we can find Ahmad ibn Hanbal saying, do not blindly follow my rulings. Those of Malik, Al-Shafi'i, Al-Awza'i, or Al-Thawri, take your rulings from whence they took theirs. Take your rulings from whence they took theirs. So rather than following blindly the rulings, then we should find out where these rulings came from and then extract our rulings on that basis from there, as opposed to extracting the rulings just merely from the statements of the scholars. In another statement, Ahmad ibn Hanbal was recorded to have said, the opinions of Al-Awza'i, Malik, and Abu Hanifa are simply opinions. and to me they're all equal. But the real criterion for right or wrong is in the hadiths. So this is Ahmad ibn Hanbal stressing that the opinions of human beings, they're all equal. Or of course with the exception of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and the prophets in general. But of others who are deducing rulings, they're equal, meaning that we can give them equal weight. If we feel one is more correct than the other, we can go along with it, based on our own understanding. And the one that we may go along with may not necessarily be the one which is most correct. That's a reality. But what we can be certain of, as Ahmad ibn Hanbal pointed out here, is that if the hadith is clear on the topic, it supports one particular side, then that is the criterion that everybody should go by. And it was pointed out that Imam Ahmad also had said that whoever rejects an authentic hadith of Allah's Messenger is on the verge of destruction. Anyone who rejects an authentic hadith of Allah's Messenger is on the verge of destruction. Now the students of the Imams, what we find is that they follow the same tradition. Being the great students that they were, they had no qualms about overriding the rulings of their teachers. So, as is mentioned, Abu Yusuf Muhammad al-Hasan differed from Abu Hanifa, who was their teacher, in about 1/3 of the rulings of their madhab. About 1/3. Abu Yusuf and Muhammad ibn al-Hasan al-Shaybani, these are the main two students of Abu Hanifa, they differed and overturned 1/3 of the rulings of Abu Hanifa. And similarly, al-Muzani and others differed with al-Shafi'i on many of his rulings. So, as we consider the statements of the earlier scholars to indicate that taqleed was against the way of the Prophet ﷺ, and this was not the goal of the hadith of the fiqh. The goal was to combine the hadiths, to explain them, and to show how to apply them. So the spirit of the madhab of the early scholars was a flexible spirit, one in which the scholars had no qualms about going from scholar to scholar, until they're convinced, getting the evidence from here, there, and everywhere. Today, it's often said that, if you shop around, you'll be misguided. One should not go around from scholar to scholar taking the opinions of various scholars. This should not take place. Of course, as a fundamental principle, it is quite permissible, as this is what the early scholars had done. However, if one is shopping around, what we call fatwa shopping, where we really have something that we want to do, and we're just looking to find somebody who is going to say it's okay to do it, then that's misguidance. Because we're not seeking the truth, we're just seeking support. It doesn't matter to us that what we want to do is not in fact correct, but we're just looking to find a scholar who would say that what we're doing is okay, or nearly okay, or something like this. So that is misguidance, that is fatwa shopping, and that is evil. But where one is seeking the truth, one sits under a scholar, he gets some information, and they're not convinced. Then they sit under another scholar, they sit under a third scholar, a fourth scholar, they sit under different scholars to try to get a clearer understanding, to better understand what they're trying to do and what's permissible for them, then that is perfectly legitimate. The other point is that when we look at the hadiths, they must be accepted because the rejection of hadiths is in fact declared in the Qur'an. In the 4th chapter, Surah An-Nisa, verse 65, it is declared there as a basis for being declared a disbeliever. It is that serious, that to actually reject evidence from Allah or from His Messenger is an expression of disbelief. So we find there in the 61st verse, فَلَا وَرَبِّكَ لَا يُؤْمِنُونَ حَتَّى يُحَكِّمُوكَ فِي مَا شَجَرَ بَيْنَهُمْ ثُمَّ لَا يَجِدُوا فِي أَنفُسِهِمْ حَرَجًا مِمَّا قَضَيْتَ وَيُسَلِّمُوا تَسْلِيمًا. No, by your Lord, they do not believe until they make you the judge between them in their disputes, without being distressed over your judgment, nay, accepting it wholeheartedly. So we find in that statement of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that those who don't make the Prophet a judge between them in their disputes, because one of the roles of the Prophet ﷺ was to provide a means for resolving disputation. So how do we do it? When we get into arguments, if we resolve it by just the strongest one, forcing his opinion on the other, then of course this is a formula for chaos in the society. So the judgments need to be made on the basis of some logical, practical, and acceptable principle. And the principle is that Prophet Muhammad ﷺ's statements should be used to resolve these various issues. Another condition was added in the hadith, or in this verse concerning the hadith, that not only must we use what the Prophet ﷺ said to resolve our disputes, but also that we should not feel forced. We really didn't want to accept this ruling, but we're forced to. So we're only submitting out of having been forced. No, we should do so wholeheartedly. That's a part of the faith. That believing that what the Prophet ﷺ has ruled is the right thing, then we should display that belief by wholeheartedly accepting whatever he has ruled. So that statement, that verse from the Qur'an, contains on one hand a labeling as a disbeliever, one who does not make the Prophet a judge in their affairs, meaning he doesn't take the hadith as a means of working out disputations. And also that for it to be an acceptable mode of judgment, where we use the hadith, for it to be acceptable to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then we must use the hadith having no reservations about going with their implications or their clear rulings. So when we look back to Imam Muhammad ibn al-Hasan, in his narration of Imam Malik's book Al-Muwatta, because he went to Medina from Baghdad, he went to Medina and studied under Imam Malik and memorized his Muwatta, which became the main core book for the Maliki madhab. Not only did he memorize it, but he became one of the narrators of Al-Muwatta. But in the course of learning it and teaching it, he found new evidence which led him to contradict more than 20 major rulings of Abu Hanifa himself. So he now favored the evidence brought by Imam Malik over that of Abu Hanifa. Now some people would look at that as being a form of disrespect to the teacher. That respect to the teacher means that you follow whatever the teacher has said, you don't go against or say is wrong or any of the positions held by the teacher. So Imam Muhammad ibn al-Hasan had no hesitation in doing that. And he gave an example of one of the areas where he opposed Abu Hanifa's ruling. He said, Abu Hanifa did not feel that there were any ordained salah for istisqa, that there was actually a prayer called salat al-istisqa. There was a dua, that you just make dua, but that you actually make 2 rak'ah and so on and so on. He didn't believe that. So that was his position, that there is no such thing. But he said, after reading, learning, memorizing, and teaching Al-Muwatta, he concluded, he said, but in my opinion, the Imam should lead the people in 2 units of Salah for istisqa, make dua, and reverse his cloak. Make dua, and he turns his cloak inside out. This was the practice of the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam for Salatul Istisqa, that is this prayer, the rain prayer, prayer seeking help from Allah for rain. Another example can be found in the issue concerning the grandfather of a dead person and inheritance. Abu Hanifa was of the position that if a person died and his father died, then what would have gone to his father will not go to his grandfather. That the grandfather would not take the place of the father. However, both Abu Yusuf and Muhammad al-Shaybani both rejected Abu Hanifa's position, and they joined the position of the 3 Imams, the other major 3, giving the grandfather a 1/6 of the inheritance which would have gone to the father were he alive. This is a clear ruling in which they both of them together went against the ruling of their teacher Abu Hanifa. And another example of scholars, later scholars of this school, the Hanafi school, Isam ibn Yusuf al-Balakhi, who was himself a student of Muhammad al-Hasan and a close follower of Abu Yusuf, he himself used to make rulings which differed with those of Abu Hanifa and his 2 companions, Abu Yusuf and Muhammad al-Shaybani. So not only would he contradict the rulings of Abu Hanifa, but he would contradict rulings of his students. So you can see there's a pattern here, that the students didn't feel an obligation to stick with the rulings of their teacher, regardless of whatever evidence came to them. So he used to raise, though he was a Hanafi, and the position of the Hanafis is that you only raise your hands, takbir, in the beginning of the prayer. He used to raise his hands before going into ruku' and coming out of ruku', which is the position held by the majority of scholars and most thoroughly narrated by the companions. So he went with the position of the other 3 Imams against the position of both Abu Hanifa as well as that of Muhammad ibn al-Hasan and Abu Yusuf. Now, we also find in the Qur'an, with regards to the utilization of hadith, a warning from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala regarding those who don't use the statements of the Prophet ﷺ to judge in their affairs. We mentioned before, Allah mentioned that it is as if they don't believe. It is as if they do not believe. Because the messenger was to be followed. As Allah said, مَن يُطِعِ الرَّسُولِ فَقَدْ أَطَاعَ اللَّهِ. Whoever obeys the messenger has obeyed Allah. So that's a basic principle here. You reject the hadith, you're rejecting and disobeying the Prophet ﷺ, basically you're disobeying Allah. It comes down to the same thing, where you have, the evidence in front of you. At any rate, Allah says there in Surah Nur, verse 63, فَلْيَحْذَرِ الَّذِينَ يُخَالِفُونَ عَنْ أَمْرِهِ أَن تُصِيبَهُمْ فِتْنَةٌ أَوْ يُصِيبَهُمْ عَذَابٌ أَلِيمٌ. Let those who contradict you or contradict your command be warned that they will be afflicted with trials and a painful punishment. They will be afflicted with trials and a painful punishment. So this is a warning from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to humankind about disobeying the instructions of the prophets sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So carrying on then, we've looked at least one of the madhabs, one most known for taqleed, and we see the position of the scholars of the madhab, of their students and of the students' students. It's clear evidence that this phenomena of the madhab, people following either one of four, is something which was not originally a part of Islam, something which has crept in and has become very widespread, but that doesn't change the fact that it is something man-made and it has very negative effects on the ummah. Now, when one takes the position that taqleed should be prohibited, as Imam Shawkani himself, for example, had taken that position, taqleed should be prohibited, it's haram. But what does that mean? Does that mean then that everybody must now go to the sources of Islam, go to the Qur'an and the Sunnah, and extract their rulings? Well, no, that's not what it means, because most people will not have sufficient knowledge and information to be able to go back to these basic sources and extract the information from them. So therefore, that's not what is required of them. What is required of them is that they believe in what the Prophet ﷺ had prescribed. They believe in it. And for them to follow the efforts made by the early scholars to clarify how these evidences were to be used, etc., then that would be considered praiseworthy, something that nobody in fact can avoid, because no matter how great a scholar we're dealing with, he doesn't know everything. There will be areas that his knowledge is weaker than others. So the idea then of collecting his rulings on the basis that people should follow these rulings, that idea is rejected. We should follow the rulings of scholars. But to just gather up the rulings of any one individual scholar and say, well, you need to follow everything here. No, this is not what Islam commands us to. On the other hand, because the fact that we don't have the means, the knowledge, the ability to go to the sources and extract laws ourselves, then where do we find ourselves? We find ourselves having to rely on other scholars. That is the reality. And those scholars rely on other scholars. And there's nothing wrong with relying on others, meaning that you get information from them, you seek to know where they get their evidences from, etc. This is perfectly legitimate. But it is the blind following where, regardless of the evidence which comes to us, we will follow a particular position because it's known as the position of our madhab. That is madhab fanaticism, or the factionalism which comes out of blindly following or utilizing unsound means. So our basic principle here is that if the hadith is found to be sahih, then it should be the madhab of everyone. And if one takes that as a general guideline, then one will not be blindly following a scholar, even if we do actually call up scholars and get their opinions. We can at the same time ask those scholars who are giving us their opinions of the evidences. If they're not mentioning the evidences along with the opinion they're giving, then it's quite legitimate for us to ask, where the evidences come from, what evidence are being used, etc. Now, if one finds, because sometimes it happens, you ask a scholar and they become upset. How dare you ask me? You are an ignorant layperson. I'm a scholar. You couldn't understand even if I told you, So you just go with whatever I tell you. Well, if we find a scholar reacting in this way, then really that's a scholar we don't need to be taking our knowledge from. Because Prophet Muhammad ﷺ encouraged questioning, and his companions used to pester him with questions all the time. So to say that somebody should get upset because questions have been raised to them, this is really not acceptable Islamically. Now, the last point to clarify here is that for most of us, we don't have access to scholars to sit under. So what does one do? What we have instead are books and tapes, lectures. This is where we get our basic knowledge from. The mass of people will tend to be in that category. So what are they expected to do? Well, they're expected to work with hadiths, work with books which have explanations and evidences. Not a book where the author is just saying do, don't do, do, don't do. Why? You don't know, but just do and don't do. So we need to then choose the writings of scholars who bring the evidences. Like, for example, in fiqh, we had Fiqh Sunnah by Imam Sayyid Sabiq. Imam Sayyid Sabiq. Allah yarhamu. His book is a praiseworthy book. It's not perfect, it has some mistakes, but like, which book doesn't have mistakes? So the point is that he presents the various positions held by the various scholars in a very subtle way, and is focusing around the hadiths as the basis for explaining fiqh. And this is the correct approach and method which should be taken to avoid falling into the trap, we said, of blind following of the schools of law. Now, just summarizing what we've covered in this chapter here, the first thing is to realize that most Muslims are not aware that blind following is itself opposed to the teachings of the imams of the various madhabs. That's the first point that should be clear. To remove this idea of defending the imam. Second point, all of the imams and their students are on record as opposing the blind following of their opinions. They're on record making a variety of statements to this effect. They repeatedly emphasize the importance of referring to the primary source. Don't take from where I took. Don't take what I say, but take from where I took. Go to the sources that I came from. Thirdly, the imams and their students continuously emphasize that their rulings were subject to error. One could not depend on them 100%. Evidence may come to the contrary, and we just have to, as they say, throw it against the wall. Another point to keep in mind is that hadiths should be given precedence over personal opinion. If we have an issue to decide on, And we have an opinion on this issue. We should not give precedence to that opinion and try to attack the hadith, but if we find that the hadith is authentic, then we should conform in accordance with the hadith. And finally, I would just say that Muslims in general are required to do ittiba', follow the scholars who follow the scholars who follow the Prophet ﷺ. It is required on all Muslims in one way or another to be engaged in that activity, because this is how Islam was conveyed to us. The next topic deals with the differences among the Ummah and how we should look at these differences. Because after seeing the overall contributions to the progressive enrichment and unifying character of fiqh within the Muslim world, after seeing that, and seeing that the early generation exhibited a certain liberalness in their thinking, meaning that they were not restricted, they would study wherever they wanted to study, they expressed their ideas freely, sometimes even opposing the caliphs and suffering from it as a result of it. The reality is that in time, this free approach became a closed and rigid approach. And the Muslim Ummah suffered as the scholarship basically closed in on itself, ijtihad was banned, and people just got into blind following from that point for hundreds of years following it. And of course, what this produced then was 4 schools of law, all of which people were told to believe were correct. So if you followed any of the schools, you're on the right path, because they're all correct. And this was a big error which was promoted, because reality is that, as the scholars pointed out, the truth is one. All these answers are not correct. Simply because you can't find the answer doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't an answer there. So, if we're looking at the 10th chapter, what we find here is a discussion on the issues of differences and disagreements in general. Because difference and disagreement must take place. This is something inevitable. Human beings will differ, they will disagree. So this is something unavoidable. But the question is, how does one handle disagreement? Does one label a person who disagrees? Do we label that person a deviant? Isolate that person and try to get people to just follow the norm? No, this is not what is required at all. If that person is bringing an opinion based on evidence, then his evidence is just as valid as the evidence of those who came after him. So, what we need to understand is that, one, we cannot remove all differences. The best of generations, the Sahaba, which I mentioned earlier, they differed. So if they could have differed over issues, and these issues were not just issues outside of usul fiqh or outside of aqidah, this is not true. They did differ in all of the various areas. We maybe go to some extreme in terms of how we're dealing with people who differ, and this is of course wrong. But reality is differences will exist. The question is, what do we do with these differences? If we allow the differences to split our ranks, then we suffer the consequence. But if we allow that effort should be made to bring parties together and resolve differences, then that's what we will see. And the basic position that we should take is that differences are resolvable, and that we should sit down and try to resolve them as much as is humanly possible. If in the end we end up with two opinions, both of them strongly supported by hadith, then all we can say is that people have an option here in this matter. You may do this or you may do that. But what the Imams left behind was the general position that the madhabs were not infallible. They all began at a certain time, and scholars had different attitudes with regards to various fiqh issues at the time. And people were free to go with what they considered to be authentic. However, the attitude of many people in influential positions, etc., who are locked into the madhab, they find it unacceptable that people would not consistently follow all of the opinions held by any given madhab. And what they've done instead is they have developed a series of labels that they put on people who don't conform with their norm. As we may label them, muqallids, those who blindly follow, they may label those of us who don't follow blindly as Wahhabis or Ahl Hadith. These are terms which are used to isolate those who had taken a position against blindly following the madhabs. So, in the coming session, inshallah, we will look more closely at the concept of Wahhabism, because it is in fact the greatest sort of challenge that those people who are involved in having a new look at fiqh and its development, without being bogged down and trapped in the madhab quagmire. Those who take the option to find other sources, they are usually labeled as Wahhabis. And this term, of course, is a derogatory term. Of course, in its essence, it comes from Wahhab, one of the names of Allah. So every Muslim should be a Wahhabi in that respect. Similarly, the term Ahl Hadith, it has come to be a term to identify the heretics, those who have split off from the main body of Muslims, who don't follow madhabs, on a consistent basis. Or they may even reject the madhabs in their totality. So this became another label to put on such people and to warn people away from these people and their influences. However, the fact of the matter is that both the Ahl Hadith movement in Pakistan, India and Pakistan, as well as the Wahhabi movement in Arabia, both of them had a major impact in reviving ijtihad and thinking, and people stepping out of the confines of the madhab and taking opinions and ideas from the other schools based again on the evidence. So this is really in the end what we all have to come back to. And the idea of differences amongst the ummah, reality is that these differences are unavoidable. Everybody in all times will have them. We try to keep them to a minimum, but they're going to be there anyway. Now what do you do knowing that? Then one has to be tolerant of other positions, and at the same time one also has to be willing to hear the arguments of the other side and be willing to change one's opinion accordingly. So basically this is as far as we're going to go in this session, and in the coming session we'll go to look at the whole issue of difference in the ummah and whether this difference is something blessed or not, because there is a well-known hadith, authentic or not, wherein the Prophet ﷺ was supposed to have said, "Ashabi kan nujum, bi'ayyihim iqtadaytum ihtadaytum." My companions are like stars. If you follow any one of them, you'll be rightly guided. And he was supposed to also have said, "Ikhtilaf ummati rahma." The differences amongst my ummah, my nation, is a mercy from Allah. So we will have to look at these statements and what they imply to determine whether in fact the differences which currently exist is really a mercy from Allah. And actually I think we already know that it's not. The very fact that it led to people not praying behind each other, not marrying each other, simply because they came from different madhabs, is clear evidence that really it's not a mercy. There's no mercy in that. So then where is the mercy? Inshallah, we will look at that in our next class. We're going to stop here. If any of you have any questions concerning what we've covered so far, that is the opinions. We looked at the opinions of the students of the Sahaba, students of the leading imams of the schools of Islamic law. Did they exhibit the same kind of willingness to change opinions, go with the evidence, leave the rulings if we find different evidence? Did they follow that kind of approach? Or had they themselves begun the process of creation of the madhabs as separate entities within the body of the Muslim nation? And what we saw was that this was not the case. They didn't create any further divisions, but they did disagree with their teachers and do whatever they found to be correct based on the evidence which came to them. So following that, then we summarized this chapter, which is the 9th chapter, and then began to look at the introduction to differences among the ummah. Does anybody have any questions?
Can you give some examples of acceptable difference of opinion, like covering the face also comes under that, or?
Yeah, the example in terms of acceptable differences of opinion, where we have evidence which seems to point to the fact that covering the face is a good thing, and where we have evidence which seems to indicate that covering the face was not a required thing, for us to be able to accept both, that is the better way. To take one side, okay, if you're convinced that that's really the right side, then no harm for you to take that position, because you're supposed to follow what you're convinced of. But if you see that there is sufficient evidence on the other side to counter the evidence that you have, then you have to accept that this is a personal choice. It's okay if I chose it, but it's not necessarily a requirement that everybody has to choose it. So covering the face is something which is good. It's from the Sunnah. Wives of the Prophet ﷺ practiced it. The other believing women did so also. But sometimes the believing women went without covering their faces. And we have to accept that also and work accordingly.
that also comes under that category.
Yeah, reciting Surah Al-Fatiha after the Imam, we could look at that in that case also. Although when you add up all the evidences, it seems that reciting after the Imam has already been covered, but doesn't mean you don't do something, but to recite to yourself loud enough that you can be heard, while the Imam is reciting, then this in fact contradicts the principles of concentration. Other people are praying next to you, hear you reciting whilst the Imam is reciting. It's just confusion. It's not a positive consequence. So the position that one doesn't need to recite after the Imam. If the Imam recites, then his recitation is sufficient for those who follow him. That is if he's reciting aloud, that is the stronger position. And there are no end of similar circumstances where the schools differed in their rulings. If they can be resolved by a hadith which clarifies that one is right and one is wrong, then fine. But if they can't, then one has to be able to identify what type of difference do we have here. Do we have an opposing and conflicting difference which cannot coexist? Or do we have one that it's possible that one does one thing and does another thing? Or allows other people to do one thing and then they do something else? Okay? Any questions from the women's side? If not, Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, wassalatu wassalam ala Rasulil Kareem, wa ala alihi wa ashabihi, wa man istanna bi sunnatihi ila yawmiddin. All praise is due to Allah, and may Allah's peace and blessings be on the last Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, and on all those who follow the path of righteousness until the last day. We will be looking now at the 10th chapter, or the 10th section, where we are looking at the differences which occur amongst the ummah, and how do we handle these differences. We have seen how fiqh has evolved, and we have seen the approach of the early scholars. We've also seen how rigidity set in, and the flexibility and the vibrancy of fiqh was lost. We have seen a situation where fiqh, the schools of fiqh, became a source of division amongst the ummah, instead of being a source of added information as it was in the early days. And it is important for us at the end of it all to be able to handle those initial questions that we began this course with. The question with regard to the madhab, whether we should abandon them altogether, or whether we should just take one and follow it, or whether we should create our own madhab. As some people have stated, that the idea of functioning without a madhab is itself a madhab. The fact of the matter is that functioning without a specified madhab is a madhab. But what we propose is that it was the original madhab. In the time of the Sahaba, they functioned without a specified madhab. The time of the Tabi'een and the Tabi'ut Tabi'een, the first three generations, which were praised by Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the blessed generations, the ones known as the Salaf. When people use the term Salaf, it usually refers to them. And of course, those who followed their path in the generations that followed. The fact is that that was their approach. So we have to say that that is a perfectly legitimate approach, and it really was the original approach of the early generations of these schools of Islamic law, from the founders to their students, etc. So what we spoke about in the previous session, when we spoke about the the positions held by the great scholars with regards to blind following, as well as their students, and we went on to the issue of differences, and we mentioned that there are two main terms which are used to describe anyone who opposes the standard approach to the madhab. Either they're labeled as Wahhabi or they're labeled as Ahlul Hadith. Of course, Ahlul Hadith is a term which was originally used for the scholars like Imam Bukhari, Muslim, etc. But in later generations, it came to mean one who has deviated from the way of following the one or other of the four madhabs. Wahhabi, taken from Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, a scholar from the 18th century who led a movement of revival, calling people back to the Qur'an and the Sunnah as it was originally understood, attacking practices like tawassul, which means in the common vernacular, seeking intercession from the dead. Although tawassul as a concept in general does exist, where one may make tawassul with their righteous deeds, we ask Allah's help, His support, on the basis of some good things that we have done. This is perfectly legitimate. But calling on Allah through the dead, or calling on the dead to communicate to Allah for us, this is illegitimate. And the movement of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, which opposed this, appeared heretical because this practice had become so widespread amongst the Ummah. So those who opposed it then appeared to be innovators, when in fact they were revivalists, and what people were following, tawassul, as they understood it, was in fact an innovation which Prophet Muhammad ﷺ sought to prevent by prohibiting the building of structures over graves, or praying at graves, that is regular salah, or any other acts of worship to be done in the graveyard. Even the recitation of Qur'an was disallowed by the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. So, coming to the situation at hand where the four madhabs still exist amongst us, and there is still a da'wah there, a call to following one of them as an obligation. And this is found in some of the movements, and a number of the movements, Islamic movements that are currently active in the Muslim world today. And the arguments which they commonly use to support them, the argument quoting the hadith, ikhtilaf ummati rahma, disagreement amongst my nation is a mercy, or the other narrations of it, differences among my sahaba are a mercy for you. And another purported hadith, ashabi kan nujum bi ayyihim iqtadaytum ihtadaytum, my sahaba are like stars, you will be guided by whichever among them that you follow. And other similar narrations. Reality, of course, is that these narrations are between outright fabrications and extremely weak hadiths that could not be used as evidence. And that fundamentally, the idea of differences being a blessing contradicts the very text of the Qur'an itself. The Qur'an prohibits disagreement and argumentation. That is excessive, where it breaks the ranks. Disagreement is something, of course, which is unavoidable. No matter how much people agree upon basic principles, etc., interpretation is always going to breed some disagreements. So we find, for example, in Surah Al-Anfal, verse 46, Allah is saying there, وَلَا تَنَازَعُوا فَتَفْشَلُوا وَتَذْهَبَ رِيحُكُمْ. Do not dispute among yourselves and cause your own failure and loss of power. We also find those who split up the religion into sects being compared to the pagans, the pagan disbelievers. In the chapter Ar-Rum, verses 31-32, وَلَا تَكُونُوا مِنَ الْمُشْرِكِينَ مِنَ الَّذِينَ فَرَّقُوا دِينَهُمْ وَكَانُوا شِيَعًا كُلُّ حِزْبٍ بِمَا لَدَيْهِمْ فَرِحُونَ. Do not be like those among the idolaters who split up their religion into sects, each group happy with what they had. And this is something to some degree, what we experience today with the various groups not able to work with each other, happy, to be following their own leaders at the expense of others and opposing others. This is a description of this common situation today. And also we find in Surah Hud, verses 118, 119, وَلَوْ شَاءَ رَبُّكَ لَجَعْلَ النَّاسَ أُمَّةً وَاحِدَةً وَلَا يَزَالُونَ مُخْتَلِفِينَ إِلَّا مَنْ رَحِمَ رَبُّكَ. If your Lord had so willed, He could have made humankind one people. He didn't. He made humankind people from a variety of different backgrounds. But He explained elsewhere that it is in order لِتَعَارَفُوا, that they know each other and know the greatness of Allah in their creation. So Allah said here, if your Lord had so willed, He could have made humankind one people. But they will not cease to dispute except those on whom your Lord has bestowed His mercy. So in these two verses, Allah indicates that His mercy is on those who don't dispute. So the disputation obviously is not a mercy. So anyone who would claim that differences as a result of disputation is in fact a mercy is misguided. And of course we have in Surah Ali Imran, verse 103, وَاعْتَصِمُوا بِحَبْلِ اللَّهِ جَمِيعًا وَلَا تَفَرَّقُوا. Hold on firmly to the rope of Allah together and do not split up. It's a clear command for overcoming the differences and not allow it to drive wedges between our hearts. So what then do we do with the differences among the Sahaba? Why were there differences among the Sahaba when Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was amongst them? Why weren't they a unified body? Well, there were differences which occurred in the lifetime of the Prophet ﷺ, differences which occurred after his lifetime during the era of the Khulafa Rashidun. And there were differences which were a consequence of differences of opinion resulting from different interpretations. Because though we have the Qur'an and the Sunnah, some texts are or have more than one possible interpretation. And where we don't have clear evidence to indicate one or the other, then it's left open to people to conclude. And also we have to note that the compilation of everything the Prophet ﷺ said and didn't take place in that time, in that early period. So it's quite possible that some of the companions would hold positions that other companions did not, based on narrations which came to them which didn't come to the others, right? But in general, when we look back at all of the differences that occurred among them and the generation which followed them, we have to say that Prophet Muhammad ﷺ gave a general principle which governs their differences, and that's how we have to approach it. He said, if a judge strives his utmost and makes a correct ruling, he receives 2 rewards. But if he strives and errs, he receives 1. That is the general principle that governs the differences of the early generation. That people came to differences as a result of trying to find the correct ruling. So where that effort leads to differences, then we have to be tolerant and know that both sides are rewarded. Not that both sides are correct, because this is 2 different things. What those who blindly follow the madhabs indicate or try to promote is the idea that each and every one of the madhabs is correct in and of itself, regardless of the fact that they oppose each other, they differ with each other on some fundamental issues. Of course, there are many fundamentals, which are shared by all of the schools of Islamic law. So I don't want to give the impression that they are differing on virtually every point. No, there's a mass of information which they're all agreed upon. But then there is a body of information also which they disagree. So what we don't want to find ourselves in is in a position where we're trying to justify 2 rulings which cannot coexist. Where one school says this is halal, the other school says it is haram. Because something cannot be halal and haram at the same time. So when we look at issues of differences in that early generation, we see actually that there was an effort made to try to cover them, to keep them from going and actually affecting the ummah as a whole. So where, for example, Umar ibn al-Khattab, the second righteous caliph, heard of a dispute between Ubay ibn Ka'b and Ibn Mas'ud, Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, 2 of the leading companions. They were caught up in a dispute over the issue of praying in a single piece of cloth, right? Umar ibn al-Khattab became very upset, and he called on both of them and told them, have you two of you of Allah's messenger's companions disagreed, and they are among those whom the masses, and you are amongst those who the masses watch closely and imitate? This is the point, that disagreement, which appears externally, can create an air or an environment of disagreement if it's not kept under control. So Umar ibn al-Khattab told them to desist from these disagreements, which would come into disputes. Not that they may not disagree amongst themselves, but they keep it amongst themselves. And he went on to say, Ubay is correct and Abdullah ibn Mas'ud should desist. And if I hear of anyone disputing about this matter after this point, I will deal with him. Omar was very firm in squashing open disagreements and disputation, which he saw as potential danger for the ummah. we find that Ibn al-Qasim, who was one of the main students of both Imam Malik and Imam al-Layth, he said, I heard Malik and al-Layth both say concerning the differences amongst the Sahaba, people say there's leeway for them in it, but it is not so. It was a case of right and wrong rulings. So here Imam Malik denies the claim that differences amongst the Sahaba represent some kind of mercy, meaning you have options. So wherever they differed, you can either choose this or you can choose that. This is not the case, as Imam Malik points out. The differences were a case of right and wrong. It didn't mean every single difference was that case. There were cases where, in fact, there were two options, because they were both based on practices of the Prophet ﷺ. For example, praying, raising your hands after the first takbir. Prophet ﷺ, on some occasions, didn't raise his hand after the first takbir, saying Allahu Akbar. Right? Whereas in most often, he did used to raise it going into ruku' and coming out of ruku'. So these are two practices of the Prophet ﷺ. So where the Sahaba differed on this, it is permissible. It's not a problem. You can choose one or choose the other. Right? But most of the differences, which had to do with their opinions, there were issues of right and wrong. So Imam Malik said, there's no leeway in it. In other words, just as we recognize that the early scholars are rewarded for their mistakes, it doesn't mean that we can now say, well, since they're rewarded for their mistakes, we can just follow it because they're rewarded for it. No. If we have information, it is our responsibility to find out as much as we can which of the positions are in fact correct. And if we find out what is in fact correct, then that's what we have to follow. We cannot argue that, well, the Imam is rewarded even if he was in error. This is not the way. If we can't do that with the Sahaba, as Imam Malik pointed out, because that's what he's saying really, it was an issue of right and wrong rulings, meaning you have to follow the right ruling and leave the wrong one, then we can't do it with anyone after the Sahaba. We have Ashhab, another of Imam Malik's students, saying, Malik was once asked whether one was safe to follow a ruling related to him by reliable narrators who heard it from the companions of the Prophet ﷺ, meaning a narration indicating the rulings of the Sahaba. Is one correct if one follows the rulings of a Sahabi? Simply, is he a star? Following him, you are rightly guided like the North Star? Imam Malik said no. By Allah, not unless it is correct. Unless that ruling that the Sahabi made was itself correct. It's not enough to say simply a Sahabi had that opinion. The truth is only one. This is what Imam Malik points out. The truth is only one. Can two opposing opinions be simultaneously correct? The opinion which is correct can only be one. So he squashed the idea of two schools of thought being right, both right, when they hold diametrically opposed positions, contradictory positions. Imam al-Shafi'i, student, al-Muzani, he put it this way: the companions of Allah's Messenger disagreed from time to time and declared each other mistaken. And it's not only that they disagreed, but they also said, so-and-so is mistaken, so-and-so is not correct. Some of them examined the statements of others and researched them thoroughly. Therefore, if all of them felt that whatever they said was correct, they would never have investigated each other's statements or declared each other mistaken. So, this is shooting down again the argument that all of the madhabs are correct. The Sahaba didn't take that approach. They declared wrong those who they felt were wrong among them, their own compatriots. Then Al-Muzani went on to argue that a person who allows disagreements, claiming that both scholars strove to arrive at a decision, even though one said it was halal and the other one said it was haram, and they're both correct. He suggested that the person should be asked, the one who argues this, whether they're basing that ruling, that conclusion, on a fundamental text, that meaning that's from the Qur'an or the Sunnah, or whether it was based on qiyas or deduction. So if he says, Al-Muzani went on to say, if he claims that it was based on a fundamental text, he said, how could a fundamental text how can you claim that it's based on a fundamental text when the fundamental text itself opposes disagreement and condemns it? Can a fundamental text be used to support disagreement, meaning that both people disagreed and they're both correct, so we can accept that disagreement? No, the fundamental text opposes it. So if they back off the fundamental text and say, well, no, it's by qiyas, then the argument is, if the fundamental text is opposed to disagreement, and you have deduced from that fundamental text a ruling, that ruling must be one which somehow implies that disagreement is not correct. How can you deduce a ruling from a fundamental text which is completely opposite to what the fundamental text says? It is illogical. So he argued logically that there's no way to support this argument. It's just a fanatical argument of those who close the door of ijtihad and who oblige people to follow one or other of the madhabs. The text also points out that the approach of the Sahaba in general towards issues that they differed on was that whenever a hadith came to them to the contrary, they would accept it and give up whatever position they held. And we gave the example also of Imam Malik, who used to rule that washing between the toes wasn't necessary. But then when one of his students who had studied under Imam al-Layth narrated to him a narration of the Prophet ﷺ used his little finger to clean between his toes, then Imam Malik said that narration is a good narration, and from then on he immediately started to narrate and to teach that washing between the toes was from the Sunnah. That was their approach, that was their way. It was the period of decline and stagnation where madhab fanaticism arose, where people now clung on to their madhabs regardless. The court debates that took place, where prizes were given to the winning scholar in defense of his madhab, promoting further fanaticism or madhab fanaticism. So what tended to happen in that is that since the people were no longer flexible, when evidence came, they would just leave it and go on. Then what happened is that the differences which occurred in the first generations now became exploded. They became huge differences, which led ultimately, as we spoke before, about the ruling that a Hanafi should not marry or is not allowed to marry a Shafi'i. I mean, that is a huge ruling. How did they get there, we ask? Well, if you go back to the root of it, it goes back to an opinion of Abu Hanifa, right? That Iman did not increase or decrease. That was his opinion. The other Imams didn't hold that. Their opinion was it decreased and it increased. And there are texts in the Qur'an and Sunnah which imply it. But Abu Hanifa argued interpretations of those texts, and his position was Iman neither decreases or increases, meaning you either have it or you don't have it. Right? So, on the basis of that opinion, and that opinion didn't split the ranks in the time of Abu Hanifa and his students. His students prayed behind Imam Malik, studied under Imam Malik, and the students studied under Imam Shafi'i, prayed behind each other, no problem. However, later on down the line, scholars made a ruling that if you are asked the question, are you a believer? Hal anta mu'min? Hal anta mu'min? It is haram to say, I am a believer, insha'Allah. Ana mu'min, insha'Allah. It is haram. Why? Because saying insha'Allah implies doubt. Right? Allah said, don't say you're going to do anything tomorrow except saying insha'Allah, because you're not sure. There is an element of doubt there. So you should add insha'Allah. You plan to do this. Right? Now, according to the ijma' of the scholars, doubt in one's belief is equivalent to disbelief. If you say, I'm not sure I'm a believer, you're a disbeliever. You're a disbeliever. That is something the scholars are unanimous on. Whether they're Hanafis, Shafis, or anybody, they all agree on that. If you have doubt about your belief, then you're a disbeliever. Right? So, therefore, the only acceptable answer, according to the Hanafi scholars, was, Ana mu'min. Finish. I am a believer. That's it. So, it meant then that the ruling of the scholars of the other schools, where they allowed this statement of insha'Allah after stating they believed, it basically put them in a state of disbelief. Now, of course, they didn't openly say that. And definitely the early scholars had nothing to do with that. But this was subtly underground there. I mean, it's like the Shia who say that Sunni Muslims are Muslims, but they're not mu'min. They're not mu'mins, right? And later on they tell you only mu'mins are going to paradise. So what are they telling you in the end, right? It's that you're Muslim. It's okay. Yeah, we consider you Muslim. But in the end, you're not going to paradise, then you're going with the disbelievers to hell. So, what is the value of saying you're Muslim? So, it is something similar to that, which then led, because of this huge difference, Hanafi scholars to rule that it was not permissible for a Hanafi to marry a Shafi'i. So something which was a minor point, Iman increases or decreases, became you can't marry a Shafi'i. And that is because of the fact that that flexibility, that respect for different opinions, was lost. When you had that rigidity, where each school now was a religion unto itself, then this is the natural consequence. Of course, just to, clear your minds, so you don't go away from this thinking, well, which one is it, right? Reality is that saying, I'm a believer, inshallah, is permissible. It was a position held by the majority of scholars based on the fact that this inshallah doesn't mean doubt. It is not implying doubt. Every time you say inshallah, it doesn't necessarily imply doubt. Because Prophet Muhammad ﷺ taught Aisha radiallahu anha that when she goes to the graveyard. She asked him, what should I say when I go to the graveyard? And he told her to say, Assalamu alaikum ahl al-diyari min al-mu'minin wal-muslimin. Okay? Peace be upon you, people of this abode, from the believers and the Muslims. Believing, Muslims of the higher level, Muslims of the general level. Right? Insha'Allah, nahnu, insha'Allah, bikum lahiqun. We will, God willing, Allah willing, insha'Allah, be joining you. Before that, they said, Nasalullah lana wa lakum al-afiyah. We ask Allah, for you and for ourselves, a good state. And they close the dua saying, we will, inshallah, be joining you. Now the question is there any doubt that we will be joining them? Of course not. Everybody is going to die. We will join them. That is absolute. If we can't be certain about anything, we can be certain about that one. We're all going to die. So, saying inshallah here, taught by the Prophet Muhammad himself, is clear evidence that inshallah can be used, as they say, for barakah, littabarruk, noting that everything is ultimately in the hands of Allah. So, just to clear that ruling, you don't have any doubts about marrying Hanafis or Shafi'is afterwards. So, what we're saying here, basically, is that the approach or the attitude that we should hold towards differences, and we have them today, is on one hand, of respecting people's rights to differ. On the other hand, trying to ensure that the differences are based on knowledge and not just based on emotion, on culture, etc. So where we find people differing, not because they know the evidence and they are convinced of the opposite of what you're saying, in which case you have to say, okay, mashallah, that's your opinion, you have one and I have one. Based on this issue, I have my evidence, you have your evidence, and you choose what you feel is most correct for yourself. And I have to respect your right to do that. And you respect my right to do that also. Like the issue of niqab. Those who are arguing for niqab, those who argue against niqab, that it's obligatory. Everybody agrees that it's rewardable, something rewarded, something commendable. Allah loves it, etc. But obligatory, this is where the difference comes. The scholars bringing evidence for it, scholars bring evidence against its obligation. So when you look at all the evidences, in the end it comes down to what are you convinced of? And then you have to act in accordance with what you're convinced of. But you have to respect the right of others to not be convinced and be convinced of the other position. It doesn't mean you can't try to show them, but after you've tried, then becomes the problem. We're all ready to try. But now when a person has been shown what you think is enough to convince them, they've brought all of the evidence, and you feel they should be convinced, now what do you do if they're not convinced? This person is hopeless, misguided. This is the reaction that tends to happen, which is what's incorrect. Simply because you are convinced of this evidence doesn't mean that everybody's going to be convinced when you produce it. Maybe the way in which it was presented to you was so convincing, you had no doubt about it. But now how you are presenting it is not so convincing. So other people are not convinced by it. And you have to accept that can be the case, So where there's evidences, then we should be prepared to respect the right of others to hold other positions. But now, where the person is holding that position not based on any evidence, that's just how we did it in our village. That's how we, so quote unquote Muslim of this area, that's what we do. So the difference is now an emotional difference because of an emotional commitment to the culture, to the custom. People are defending it. This is where now you don't have to respect their right to hold another opinion. You don't have to respect it, meaning leave them to it and let them go ahead. No, you can try this way, that way, the other way. Keep at them as long as they will hear you. When they close the door and say, no, enough, go away, okay, then you have to stop, right? But you can pester because of the fact that they're taking the position based on emotion. So what you try to do in these cases is not to bring the hard evidence to them, because the hard evidence, usually when people are caught up in emotional situations, hard evidence doesn't have an impact. So what you have to do is to raise their level of understanding so that they can respect the idea of evidence. So remember, they're not in a state of looking for evidence. It's like, for example, an experience which I had years ago when I was studying in Medina, where studying in the circles of Sheikh Nasruddin Albani, he taught the idea that you could pray with your shoes on. Of course, for me, when I first heard that, I said, what? Pray with your shoes on? Because I had initially come into Islam, I was taught my early Islam by Hanafis, and the idea of praying with your shoes on, that is just unthinkable. You can't even pray on the regular ground, on the ground. No, it has to be pak. You have to take a white piece of cloth or whatever, you put it on there before you can pray. To just go and pray in a walkway or anything where anybody walks, it's unthinkable. So now praying with your shoes on that has walked in the bathroom and walked out of the bathroom and all these other kinds of things, it's just unthinkable. So it was quite a shock for me, in the early days when I sat in the circle and I heard this. And Shaykh Nasruddin explained the evidences he brought from Bukhari, from Muslim, and so on and so on. So obviously it's quite clear. This is something permissible. In fact, the Prophet ﷺ even instructed his companions, pray with your shoes on. He took off his shoes one time in a salah, and they all took their shoes off. And then afterwards, when he turned to them, asked, what did they do? Because they had seen him in the front row, they had seen him take his shoes off. So they all took their shoes off. So he turned around and told them, don't do that, pray with your shoes on. I only took it off because Jibreel came and informed me that there was some filth on the bottom of my shoes. So I took them off. So meaning, if you find there's filth on the bottom of your shoes, then you take it off. If you come to know it, you do it, you don't pray with your shoes on. So, alhamdulillah, this was clear, understandable. And where we were, outside of the main city of Medina, we're in an area called Har al-Sharqiyah, where the masjid there had a gravel floor. It was made from gravel. And we just had these kind of plastic mats, very thin plastic mats on top of it, which you could stand on or you could remove and pray with your shoes on. So people would pray in the masjid, learning this new sunnah and the rewards of reviving the sunnah. We used to put on our shoes and pray there, praying with our shoes on. Of course, for the local people who were praying, there was something of a surprise for them, but they were informed, and alhamdulillah, they accepted it. And some people prayed with the shoes on, some with the shoes off, but many of us prayed with our shoes on. Anyway, after that, some brothers got the idea that they needed to introduce this sunnah in Masjid al-Nabawi, right? To go into the city and to bring alive this sunnah in the Prophet's mosque. At that point, they were advised, brothers, it's okay. We've revived the sunnah out here. We don't need to go there where the people are not mentally ready for this. You're not, if you pray with your shoes off, it's not against the sunnah. Prophet ﷺ did that too. So no need. But these brothers were adamant. They wanted to make the people know this sunnah. So what are they gonna confront now? This is knowledge being brought in direct confrontation with custom. So they came in at Fajr, group of them, walking in the front line of the masjid. The door which comes from the outside, it takes you right to the front line. And in the front line, in Fajr, you'll see these old brothers, Afghanis, Pakistanis, Turks, and others who are there. They've come early, and they've sat and filled that front row, few spaces there. So when they see these brothers walking in with their shoes on, they were upset. They pointed to their shoes. Tell them, take off the shoes. They didn't want to say anything to them. Pointing to the shoes, take it off. Outside. Giving signals to them to put the shoes outside. The brothers are walking in. They're going to keep alive the sunnah. And, of course, the momentum builds as more and more people are seeing them. More and more people are starting to stand up. And next thing we know, we have a fight in Masjid al-Nabawi. These are all young guys in their early 20s, 19, whatever, young guys. And these were old men. But this had to do with desecrating the masjid of the Prophet. So they became like lions. They grabbed these young men and bodily threw them out of the masjid. They felt that they had protected the masjid from desecration. And those brothers hitting the concrete with their heads and their shoulders and whatever, felt that they were fighting for the sunnah. But what they did was wrong. As was explained to them, it was wrong. On one hand, the people were not prepared. They had never heard of this. So it is logical for them to reject it. Secondly, we also have to consider praying in Har Sharqiyya on a gravel floored masjid, as was the case in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, it was sand. It's not a problem, even if you have something on the bottom of your shoes. But now when we have put carpets inside of the masjid, and the carpets don't go anywhere, they just vacuum them. If you walk into the masjid with something on the bottom of your shoe, you've stepped in some dog poo or something like this on the way, and you stepped in the masjid, that smell is going to remain. It's not going to go away. Vacuuming is not going to take it away. So very easily, the masjid could become very, very uncomfortable, very smelling very badly. So we have to take into account this new situation where there are rugs in the masjid. And they're not, shampooed that often. They will vacuum them to remove the dust, but they're not going and shampooing them daily, which would be something impossible in huge masjids like Masjid al-Nabawi. So we have to understand that such a practice is unwise. It is da'wah without hikmah. As Allah said, "Ud'u ila sabili rabbika bil hikmati wal maw'idati al hasana." Call to the way of your Lord with hikmah, with wisdom and wise preaching. This was not with wisdom and not with wise preaching. The only way would be to educate those people, to raise their level of understanding, to be able to accept. And then, if you're going to even pray in there, you want to wear shoes on, then put on a pair of ships, which you haven't been walking around outside and, it's got smells and all these other kinds of things. So you've brought alive the sunnah in the Masjid al-Nabawi. So we have to understand that where we're dealing with custom and tradition, those people who are opposed to what we're teaching, is based on ignorance, then we have to educate them, because the only remedy for ignorance is knowledge. We have to educate them, lift them up to the point where they can accept that information. In that way, we're able to preserve the ranks of Muslims, keep alive the sunnah where it is possible, give advice, and accept differences which are based on knowledge and information. Okay, with that, inshallah, we'll stop here. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdika, nashhadu an la ilaha illa ant, nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk. Actually, I should have asked you if you had any questions, but I see we have hit the end of our time. Maybe we can take one question from the men's side and one from the women's side, if there are. If none,
there is a feeling that comes, when both have the same opinion or same level of, both may be correct, then how do you think that, which opinion to take?
okay. Assalamu alaikum. A question from the women's side, we'll go on to yours. When a person is researching an issue on which people differed, scholars differed, is it a requirement that a person puts aside his own personal feelings? So it means that he's going to research it, as we say, without bias. It is important. Yes, it is important. Because if you're going in to research with a biased opinion, then of course you will tend to favor whatever information comes to support your opinion and gloss over or ignore evidence which doesn't. So it is important that a person approaches an issue with an open mind. It doesn't mean that you can cancel your opinion or what you held or whatever, but you try to keep it in the background so that it doesn't dominate your research, and try to do that as neutrally as possible. The other question had to do with a case where you have researched both sides, and in the end, you cannot choose one over the other. They're sufficiently supported by evidence. What do you do now? You take the one which is most applicable to your circumstance. And if you find another circumstance in which it's not most applicable, you take the other one. That's a simple solution. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك.